Today, we'll be looking at hopefully a figure that is of interest to many of you, and that is the figure of Celsus. And Celsus is important because he is the earliest full-scale critic of Christianity. And I have a basic thesis about Celsus. I think that every argument that has been made against Christianity in all of time since Christianity appeared on the scene is foreshadowed by something which Celsus said. And there's many things that Celsus said that, in fact, he says better than modern critics of Christianity. So in a sense, yeah, he's the Christopher Hitchens of antiquity, or he has been called the Voltaire of antiquity. And it's a wild ride. Now, your access point to get to Celsus, though, is through Origen. And Origen writes a full-scale 8-book critique of Celsus called Against Celsus, or you'll see it sometimes in the Latin as Contra Celsum. And in that work, Celsus is preserved verbatim, probably about 70 to 80%, because Origen just goes through line by line and tells you, here's what Celsus says, and here's my refutation. One of the fun things about reading it with Origen is, even today, one can see that sometimes Celsus even sounds better than Origen's refutation. So, Origen is still struggling to defeat Celsus, even though by the time that Origen is writing, Celsus has been dead probably for 70 years, or maybe a little bit less. But in Origen writes his refutation around 248. So it's quite a difference in time. This is going to be a long quotation, so forgive me for that. But just to give you a taste of Celsus and his intellectual firepower. So he begins addressing the Christians. What led you to believe, except that he, that is Jesus, foretold that after death he would rise again? How many others produce wonders like this to convince simple hearers? They say that Orpheus did this among the Odrysians, and Protesilaus, and Thessaly, and Heracles at Tanarum, and Theseus. Or do you think that the stories of these others really are myths, which they appear to be, and yet that the ending of your tragedy is to be regarded as noble and convincing? His cry from the cross when he expired, the earthquake and the darkness? While he was alive, he did not help himself, but after death he rose again and showed the marks of his punishment and how his hands had been pierced. But who saw this? A hysterical female, as you say? And perhaps some other one of those who were deluded by the same sorcery, who either dreamed in a certain state of mind and through wishful thinking had a hallucination due to some mistaken notion, an experience which has happened to thousands, who wanted to impress others by telling this fantastic tale, unquote. So you can really see here that Celsus, who's writing so early in the history of Christianity, is foreshadowing so many of the arguments against Christianity that appear and reappear throughout the centuries, and that were refined in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century. He's already appealing to psychological hallucination. He's using his comparative tactics to talk about other Greco-Roman deities and heroes. And Celsus, who is a Greco-Roman himself, is very familiar, in fact, probably more familiar with figures like Orpheus, Heracles, and Theseus than he is with Jesus. And he is one of our first witnesses to a truly critical reader of the Gospels who did not take them as history, but as fantastical tales, as he calls myths. It's really amazing to hear someone so early foreshadow so much. But let's look at some of the basic info that we can for Celsus. Although Origen thought wrongly that Celsus was an Epicurean, it is beyond doubt that Celsus was a Platonist, and a fairly sophisticated Platonist who lived from the mid to late 2nd century. He probably lived in Egypt, likely Alexandria, and I'll get to the arguments for that in a moment. And he probably had direct experience of areas like Palestine and Phoenicia, which by boat were only a week away. How do we know where Celsus might come from? Well, there have been several hypotheses. Some have wanted to put him in Rome, but for me, the regular demonstration of distinctly Egyptian knowledge shows, I think, that Celsus is writing from Egypt, or at least spent a very long time there. If we look at some of the data, and I'll just throw up three indications here, there are more. He notes in Book 168 that Egyptians, as he says, quote, for a few obols, that is basically short change, they make known their venerable lessons in the midst of marketplaces and drive out demones, or out of people, and blow away diseases and invoke the souls of heroes, displaying expensive banquets, tables, cakes, and condiments, which are non-existent, and who make non-living things move as if they were animals, unquote. Now, this is a very extraordinary testimony, by the way, as an aside here, of what Greco-Roman religion looked like on the ground. It wasn't this, pristine palace of thought, this cloud nine contemplation stuff. Greco-Roman religion, practiced by ordinary agents, was full of things that Christians and non-Christians have called magic, and that involve things like making people see things that aren't really there, healing diseases, and invoking dead people or heroes, and producing small miracles, like having other objects move on command, like a table or something like that. Those kinds of everyday experiences of religion were going on in the marketplaces. And Celsus, the only way he can have access to this stuff is if he's walking through the marketplaces, which of course he did. Celsus also notes, and this is also a quote, that Egyptians have glorious precincts and groves, many of which survive today, majestic and beautiful entrance ways, astounding temples, splendid awnings all around, with rites that are solemn and secretive. But when one enters and goes inside one of these temples, one sees them bowing down to cats, monkeys, crocodiles, goats, and dogs, unquote. Now, this is another really amazing testimony of Celsus and what his notion of Egyptian religion is and what he thinks is going on. He's obviously not an insider, and in some respects, he's quite narrow-minded. But what he gives witness to is Egyptian religion when it was alive and well. And it was definitely alive and well in the 2nd century. And unlike other critics who also make fun of the Egyptians for worshiping animals, Celsus gives us something different, this wonderful description of actual living temples with things like awnings and decorated gateways and trees and things that just aren't there anymore. Right now, if you go to Egypt and see the temples, they are just stone husks of what they were, fragments of what they were. But Celsus saw them in all their glory, and he gives this very nice indication. And then finally, something very distinctive to Egypt. Celsus knew the 36, what he calls demones, but are actually decans. And there's 36 of these. They're distinctive to Egypt, and they're in control over, each of them is in control of 10 degrees of the zodiacal circle. And they were thought to have control over the human body. And Celsus is even privy to some of their distinctively Egyptian names. So this is the kind of knowledge that one doesn't get through mere book learning. This is the kind of knowledge that one would get by actually living in Egypt, interacting with religious officials and priests in temples in Egypt, as well as some of these marketplace religious entrepreneurs who are trying to sell religion as they understood it. So that's the argument for his Egyptian provenance. If we take a look at the date, there's a couple of things which Celsus mentions that he's aware of. First of all, he's aware of Antinous' deification by Hadrian, and we can date that pretty precisely to 130. Antinous was Hadrian's young boyfriend, and Antinous accidentally drowned in the Nile River, and Hadrian was absolutely mortified. Celsus is also aware that the Jews had been banished from their homeland, so he must be writing after 135, when that occurred after the Bar Kokhba revolt. He's also aware of Epictetus, and Epictetus, if you don't know him, is this really punchy, fun, Stoic philosopher who lived as far up until about probably the late 130s. But Arrian, who died around 160, is the one who wrote up the lectures of Epictetus. And so if you get a copy of the discourses of Epictetus, these are written by Arian, and Arian died later. So probably Celsus is aware of something that's written in the 140s or 150s. And then he says that he also wrote during a time when multiple emperors reigned. And that gives us two options. Either Marcus Aurelius is reigning with his younger co-emperor between 161 and 169, or Marcus is reigning with his son called Commodus, and that would be between 177 and 180. And most scholars choose the latter date. So most scholars you'll see have Celsus writing between 177 and 180. And that's a very precise date. And possibly that is the correct date. If we look at the thesis, and it's quite a long treatment, if you've read it, I won't say it's as long as, some of the modern anti-Christian tractates, like from Richard Dawkins or something like that, but it's pretty long. And if you look at Celsus's thesis, in a sense, it's both similar and different to what we find in modern anti-Christian literature. For Celsus, he believed that there was an ancient doctrine known by all ancient peoples, including the Egyptians and the Jews, but that this doctrine, what he calls the aletheis logos, the true doctrine, was perfected and refined by the Greeks. And Christianity, because it's a break-off movement from Judaism, represents a degradation of the ancient doctrine, which is not only foolish, but also impious, because you're not supposed to break away from your fathers and ancestors. And that is one of the reasons, if not the chief reason, why Celsus thought that Christianity must be wrong, because it's a movement of rebels against their own intellectual tradition, that is, for them, which would be Judaism. For Celsus, Judaism is already a kind of degradation from Egyptian religion, because he believes that the original Jews were Egyptians, that they were kicked out of Egypt. And then Christianity is a further degradation of Judaism. So he believes in the past, our ancestors had the truth, but since then it has been slowly degraded. And Christianity represents that degradation in a, unfortunately, virulent form, like a virus, which poisons the mind of the entire empire and throws the entire empire into confusion, because the more that Christianity spreads, the less worship is given to the traditional gods, who then respond with wrath, or by simply not protecting the Roman Empire, which was, as we know, finally destroyed in the West in the late, the 5th century. In terms of the outline of Celsus's work, which he calls the True Doctrine, if we look at books 1 and 2, should be interesting to many, because it's primarily a Jewish critique of the life of Jesus as presented in the Gospels. In book 3, Celsus says that only stupid people are Christians. In book 4, he has a full-on critique of the Incarnation, the book of Genesis, the final judgment, Christian exceptionalism, and anthropocentrism. In book 5, he turns to critique physicalist understandings of the resurrection and to point out Christian diversity, which is interesting. In book 6, he begins critiquing special revelation, Christian demonology, creation, and the physics of incarnation, which he thinks is impossible. And in book 7, he starts criticizing Christian prophecy, eschatology, or the doctrine of the last things, and then back to demonology. And then in book 8, he launches his own argument for polytheism and critique of Christian iconoclasm and martyrdom. So it's very important to understand that Celsus isn't an atheist and would never describe himself as an atheist. He is a very pious polytheist. But as a Platonist, he thinks that all the divine powers do ultimately go back to one single and centralized power. And but that doesn't mean that that there aren't multiple gods and daimones. Of course, there are multiple gods and daimones. And truly pious people worship the true God by worshiping the powers underneath the primal God. That's his basic position. One of the special issues which I should mention also is that in those initial books, books 1 and 2, Celsus introduces a figure which has been called Celsus's Jew. That is, not only does he introduce Jewish arguments, he introduces a Jew as making those arguments and actually in dialogue with Jesus himself, showing how Jesus himself is wrong, which is pretty amazing stuff. And it's this Jew that is the very first witness who presents Jesus as born of Pantera. Okay, so Celsus is our first gateway into this tradition of Jesus's actual father being Pantera. Celsus is also the first witness that Jesus learned magic in Egypt and that he came back to Palestine in order to present himself as a god. And throughout this text, it's very clear that Celsus is familiar with the Gospels of Matthew and John. He knows the Logos theology, and he's very familiar with the distinctive story of Matthew's dream visions by angels and the genealogy and Herod and the children. That's all distinctly Matthean material. And he's also aware that by his time, which is mid to late 2nd century, Christians were now convincing multitudes, which means that it's the first time that really a Greco-Roman person begins to feel threatened. Because if you go back to Tacitus or Suetonius, they are aware of Christianity, but they barely mention it, and they're not at all threatened by it. In their early 2nd century, very much the same with Pliny the Younger, who wants to learn more about Christianity in Bithynia, that is in northern Turkey, about the year 110, and he's also not very threatened by it. But by the mid to late 2nd century, Christians were beginning to make more recruits, and therefore you had the full-scale attack. I'll just close with a meditation on the task of comparison. And Celsus, he's not trying to give Christianity the benefit of the doubt. He's absolutely a critic, but he is trying to do, at least in principle, what might be considered a fair-minded kind of comparison. And this is very important when you, if you're really trying to, understand Christianity. And you can't defeat your opponent if you're not fair. And one of the things that Celsus says late in the work is, quote, "Where matters are equal, it's best to compare fairly on the same level," unquote. And it's only those comparisons which don't stack the deck that one can really create knowledge and light, actual light and not just smoke. Well, one of the things Celsus is, as I said, sometimes just fairly narrow-minded, but one of the things he says, it shows you how a Greco-Roman thinker would have thought at this time. He says, quote, "It makes no difference whether we call Zeus the Most High, or Zane, or Adonai, or Sabaoth, or Amun like the Egyptians, or Papias like the Scythians." And Celsus was perfectly happy to include Yahweh here, as one of the names for the chief deity. But he noticed that when he raised these kinds of arguments, the Christians weren't willing to accept them. And as he notes in passing, and this remains true still today, okay, among when you argue with fundamentalists, Celsus observed, quote, "If you compare him," meaning Jesus, "with Apollo or Zeus, they, Christians, will not tolerate it." And that's why I say there's really nothing new under the sun. Celsus is similar to and different from other philosophers of his time. Yes, he's a Platonist, so that means that he accepts that there's a force out there, an unnameable primal entity who can be called God or the good, and that being is the source of all good and all benefit, streaming outward toward the universe. That God creates life, which is the soul, and all sorts of deathless entities like stars, and then he leaves the stars and other lesser deities like Demones to create the lesser forms of life, which includes human beings, it includes ants and all sorts of bodies made from matter. So he shares that with other Platonists, such as Alcinous. He doesn't seem to believe in an official, like, demiurgus, lower creator. So in that respect, he's different from Numenius, but in the sense that in the classic Platonist sense that he's got many created gods and many creators, the beings that Plato called young gods in the Timaeus. He's right, center of the line there. That's orthodox Platonism, if anything is orthodox. And where he differs, where he's a bit unique, is actually on issues like animal intelligence. Plutarch and Celsus are really unique in the whole philosophical world of late antiquity in trying to attribute rationality to animals. And they really were path breakers, which is very, very exciting. That may have been because they were Neo-Pythagorean in bent. Celsus does believe in transmigration, but most Platonists did in some form, although not all Platonists thought that we could go into animal bodies. We don't know Celsus's specific position on that, but if he does believe in animal rationality, I don't think he would have a problem with degradation into animal bodies as a kind of punishment. Our souls are punished simply by embodiment, regardless of what body you're in. And so the goal is to get into a higher body or higher platform that is closer to God and more in tune and fitting our own noetic and transcendental capacities. So overall, again, similarities and differences. I guess the greatest difference is that Celsus, he spent a lot of time focusing on Christianity, whereas Plutarch never mentions it, Alcinous never mentions it, Apuleius never mentions it. I mean, people think that Apuleius is sometimes referring to Christians, but he never mentions them specifically. So Celsus, in that respect, he's quite different. Like Apuleius and like some Epicureans of his day, he's against superstition and what he considers to be superstition more broadly. So he would critique other cults like Apuleius does, of cults of the Syrian goddess and so on and so forth. Famously, Lucian knows Celsus, who was a writer against magic. That doesn't appear to be our Celsus, but the case is still open on that one. All that we know is that our Celsus is not an Epicurean.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and he shares that with, like you said, Apuleius. He shares that with Lucian, actually. Lucian, who does mention specifically in Peregrinus. So let's talk about Celsus's fragments. The work doesn't survive on its own, but through the writings of Origen. Origen was so compelled to refute the true discourse, which I find very fascinating because it was a text that was written nearly 100 years before his time. Tell us more about this.
So Celsus is anywhere in the late second century. I would put Celsus writing anytime between 170 and 200. So I would say Celsus is probably writing when Origen is a boy, is like a teenager. I think it's probably closer to like 50 years difference. But it is the case that things had changed, and Origen was a kind of a source of that change. Christians had not established a kind of scholarly presence. And so the Christians that Celsus met were, frankly, they weren't up to snuff. This was, before all the days of Christian schools and education. And they hadn't yet really invented any of that quite yet. So the Christianity that Celsus knew was quite different. It's sort of like Marcion, where we have to reconstruct Marcion's gospel from patristic quotations. So we do the same thing with Celsus, although it's a bit easier in his case because it only comes from one book, and that is Origen's Contra Celsum. And Origen, with the exception of the first part of Celsus's book, Origen quotes fairly systematically and word for word. So that becomes his technique of critiquing Celsus. Now, that's not to say that he doesn't distort some things, and he probably does rearrange a couple things. He tends to maybe remember something out of context and then repeat it again. And on occasion, he does also paraphrase. So there are problems, and that's why there would be differences in the reconstruction of the text. And scholar Johannes Arnold tries to reconstruct Celsus's original treatise. I think most scholars are fairly skeptical of that. But in my translation, for better or for worse, I just go through Origen and lift out in order everything that Origen quoted from Celsus. Some of that might not be in perfect arrangement, and so it might be useful to try to rearrange the material in Celsus's original order. But for now, because we don't have any secure method of doing that, it's probably unsafe and would lead to more misleading problems than to solutions. And also, a lot of the transitions that Celsus made and the examples and the details that Celsus had seem to be missing as well. And this is one of the problems with Hoffman's translation. Hoffman, when you're reading him, it makes you think that this is one continuous text, and Hoffman even invents the transitions between the paragraphs, which is bizarre. What I've done is I've properly numbered the text so that we can cite it, and I haven't invented any new information. So I just put ellipses in between the paragraphs, which just reminds people that we don't know how much is missing, if anything. And it's just a constant reminder that we don't have the whole treatise. Because Celsus uses very effectively this ancient rhetorical technique called prosopopeia or ethopeia, which is the technique of speech and character, which is he takes a character and he impersonates him as an actor on stage, and he tries to imagine, what a Jew would say first to Jesus and then to Jews who became Christians. And the reason why this is fascinating is Celsus doesn't appear to be just making this up out of whole cloth. The character is invented, but I think most scholars now believe that Celsus had a Jewish source that was kind of like an alternative biography of Jesus, perhaps written in mid-second century Alexandria. And this source held all these interesting traditions about Jesus was actually the son of Pantera, a Roman soldier named after Panther, you know, that he went to Egypt and he stayed there until he was in his 20s, and he hired himself out as a day laborer and he learned magic. And then he intentionally went back to Judea and proclaimed himself a god, and that all his miracles were forms of sorcery, and that he died in a horrible and disgusting way, and that he didn't morally improve his disciples. In fact, he led them all to betray him or deny him in the end. This is a kind of like the ultimate takedown of Jesus. And the document that Celsus was using doesn't survive, but reflections and developments of it do survive in the Babylonian Talmud, the uncensored versions of it, and these traditions called Toledot Yeshu. And these are medieval lives of Jesus in various forms. And we now have them translated by Peter Schaeffer. And that's really fascinating material because it's stunning how much of this Jewish critique of Jesus originated in the second century. And then as you move forward in time, the Jews are still using some of these same traditions and developing them way into the medieval period. And they get really good at, at like taking down Jesus, like systematically, like it'll knock your socks off. But yeah, Celsus is our only conduit for this early, you know, um, anti-gospel. And I do call it an anti-gospel, but I think one of the interesting things that is not always emphasized is that the gospels are themselves responses to this biography, because the gospels, at least in the final forms that we have them, and again, if you've taken my course on the gospels without apologetics, you'll understand that I understand the gospels as a waves that is edited material, and that they all reach their final form in the second century. And we can tell this because they're already responding to the kinds of charges that Celsus and this Jewish source brings up, that the disciples stole the body. Well, Matthew has an explanation for that. The fact that Jesus was such a coward in the Garden of Gethsemane, well, the Gospel of John has an answer to that. The fact that the so-called virgin birth looks so suspicious, well, the Gospel of Luke has an answer to that. Like it's definitely not a Roman soldier, and he's got this emphasis on the purity of Mary. So he's already pushing back against Jewish critiques that Mary is basically an adulteress, that she was lewd, and that she was just some country woman spinning wool. The genealogies are put in there just to ensure that both Mary and Joseph are in the royal line of David, even though how they end up in Galilee with that genealogy, who knows? But anyway, these are some of the things that the Gospels are already responding to. And of course, one of the bigger things is Jesus in Egypt. Matthew, what I like to call the Matthean wave, doesn't like the idea that Jesus spent his whole childhood and early adulthood in Egypt. So he quickly revises that story so that Jesus goes to Egypt, but only for a few years, and then he comes back as a small boy to Nazareth. But why would he make that point if he didn't already try to undercut the theory that Jesus spent basically his whole childhood and young adulthood in Egypt learning magic? So if you love Morton Smith and you love Jesus the magician, you're going to love Celsus. This is the origin of it all. Well, Plato in the Republic, Book 3, he's got two rules for theology. The first rule is that God is good. So if you see a God doing evil, that's not God. That's something else, maybe a daimon or something something lower on the scale of being. And the second rule is that God doesn't change. So that by itself would deny the incarnation if you understood the incarnation in the sort of Johannine sense as, halagos sarx agenita, the word became a bit of flesh, the word became meat. Uh, if that's the incarnation, then that is by nature impossible in a Platonist understanding. And why would they think that? Well, because it's not all, and Celsus, is very deliberate in this. He takes the Lucan saying, which is, with God all things are possible, and he says that itself is the most dangerous lie, because God can't actually do certain things, because certain things would involve God in no longer being God. So if you have God who is perfect in all respects, the only way he can change is by downgrading. So there's no upgrade for God. Conceivably, there could be a downgrade. But if you downgraded God to flesh, to some sort of union with the human soul or human flesh, that would also downgrade divine consciousness, whatever that is. And that would be very bad. I mean, conceivably, that would be physically possible, like in terms of ancient physics. But then God would no longer be God. And if God is no longer God, then God wouldn't be able to help us in the first place. So the very idea of Christian salvation through incarnation, it just doesn't work, because if God does degrade into flesh, then he's no longer able to help us because he's no longer God. So God can't save us if he's not God. So God in flesh is not God and is useless to everyone. So the resurrection has these precedents in Greco-Roman lore, where you've got Dionysus, who's he's got a real human mother, and he's got a real divine father, and then he becomes a full-fledged god. Heracles is the same thing, and Asclepius. So all these figures rise from humanity to divinity. They already have a divine father, so their transition to divinity the path is smoothed, so to speak. But they all die violently. Dionysus is ripped apart by Titans, and Asclepius is struck by lightning, and Heracles is burned alive. So they all have that in common with Jesus too, that they all die by suffering. But what they don't have in common is that when they become gods, they don't take their flesh with them. So the reason why Heracles goes on a pyre is to burn off the human element. And it's a noble death tradition. And so what Celsus thought was not only weird, but detrimental and dangerous was that Christians had this story where a man became a god. There's nothing unusual about that in terms of Greco-Roman lore. But then they kept him in flesh so that he even ascends in flesh, and presumably he's somewhere in heaven in flesh. And that is the nonsensical bit. And the reason is because for Platonists, God wouldn't want to be in flesh. A God wouldn't be in flesh because that's not the best platform for a God. It's not even the best platform for a wise human soul. We by nature, Plato says, our souls are equal in number to the stars, and we belong in something like star bodies, which are bodies of flame and fire, hot air called pneuma. We belong in the upper world. We're only down here because of training, remedial punishment. So if you're going to become a god, the very first thing you do is you get rid of this very heavy, wet platform that we all happen to be in. But the Christians, for whatever reason, are so debased and earthly in their opinions that they not only keep their deified man in a flesh suit, they want to preserve the flesh suit for themselves eternally, which is completely nonsensical to Celsus, because the flesh suit is a form of punishment. So it's like Christians are saying, oh, please punish us and punish us forever in heaven. We always want to inhabit this flesh suit, and have this same mouth and eyes and what Celsus called the non-beautiful parts of your meat sack, the reproductive organs and the anus and all the pus and the bile and whatever else can be thrown up by the human body, the blood and whatever else, right? So that stuff, is not something that Celsus would want to take with him. A Platonist would want to rise to a higher form of life. And so he's utterly surprised and flabbergasted at this. And he just thinks that Christians don't have the training mentally and the education to understand that flesh is not us. flesh is not where we belong. It's not like he's denying humanity, but he's saying that actually humanity belongs in a higher platform. It's sort of like those people who are now considered weird, like transhumanists, who are talking about like, yeah, I want to Xerox my brain and upload it into a supercomputer, and so that I can live in the internet. I mean, that sounds very weird to us, but that's pretty similar to like a Platonist version of immortality, right? I mean, you live as a noetic, unembodied substance because that is who you are. And so you're not limited by space and time anymore. You can go to Mars in a blink of an eye. You can go to the end of the universe in a blink of an eye. I mean, because you are a noetic being by nature. And the reason why you got stuck in this flesh is, you had to learn some stuff. But once you're done learning, you get rid of the suit. The very idea that Christians egocentrically appeal to the common Christian desire for self preservation, which is really a human desire, but not only self preservation of the species, self preservation of the individual flesh suit, that is simply egocentric. That is simply mistaking your importance in the universe. And it's just false. It's just a lie. The universe doesn't really care about the preservation of your flesh suit. And if you think that's wrong, go to a graveyard. Or, I don't know, to a crematory. The universe isn't interested in preserving your flesh suit. Of all the vast amounts of people who have lived and died, there's not a single trace of them. There's not a single trace. And I'm talking about billions of people. There's not even a trace of bones. And the earth just keeps on doing what it does. So the Christian idea that, God is going to regather all the matter and recreate your flesh suit and put it in heaven, that's there's something deeply metaphysically and physically wrong with that whole portrait, but it's also highly egocentric. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of against the times. Like these people say, "Oh, you're anti-body," but it's not anti-body. It's just the realization that the current body which you inhabit is not your ideal platform. You don't have to hate it, but to use the analogy of, a bird egg, birds emerge from the shell of an egg, and they don't then try to preserve the eggshell fragments. They just let that go. They don't have any special attachment to that. That was their platform, but they don't need it anymore. And Celsus cites a saying of Heraclitus that, a corpse, that's worse than shit. Just as fast as you try to get shit out of your house, you should try to get a corpse out of your house. So you just throw it out when you're done with it, if you've got something better. Well, he's very funny. Of course, he's not funny to Christians, but I mean, it depends on what you think a joke is. Like, is a joke designed to be funny to everyone? Like, probably not. A joke is not designed to be funny to the butt of the joke, but a joke can still be funny to other people, right? So Celsus, you can criticize him for being nasty, but he was attempting to use humor and to be funny, sort of like Ricky Gervais, like tells these really crude jokes, and he's like, there, you deal with it. And in many ways, that's what Celsus is today. If you're a devout Christian, you're going to be very, very offended. He says in 4.23 that the family of Jews and Christians is like a cluster of bats or ants coming out of an anthill, or they're like frogs gathering around a pond, and they have like this convention, and the frogs are talking to the other frogs, and they say that God has made all things for us, and He's told us all things beforehand. And God has abandoned the whole universe just to appear in our frog flesh. And He's come down from heaven, and He's done business with us alone, and we alone. He'll take us up to frog heaven so that we can always be frogs with Him. I mean, like he he says this to be funny, which is, it's also a project of the imagination. He says that worms claim that God exists, and we have come into existence second under Him, entirely like God, and all things are subject to us, even the stars. Not just earth, water, things like that. Everything serves us as slaves. And then God will arrive in worm form, sending His Son in worm form, and will completely torch the sinners, while the rest of us will have life eternal on earth. He's aping and mimicking Christian salvation, but he's putting it in the mouth of an animal. And Celsus is very good at this. Again, he likes speech and character, but he likes speech and character to show, in this case, how ridiculous it would seem. Like, here's a lower life form really making a big mistake about how important they are in the universe. But that's the same thing as humans do, because from a God's eye perspective, we're the ants and frogs. And this is something that Plato said, right, in the Phaedo, that so this is, actually has a good Platonist pedigree, that we are all like frogs around a pond. And Plato was thinking of the Mediterranean Sea. We inhabit everything from the Black Sea to the Gibraltar, the Straits of Gibraltar, and that's it. That's our pond. But the true Earth is above us. And if people were looking down on us, they would think that we were just frogs around a pond. The stuff that he's doing, speech and character, this is stuff that you would get in your secondary education. So like high school level rhetoric. And yeah, Celsus is higher than that. He's been to the ancient version of graduate school. So he's learned philosophy. That's where you would learn it. Um, so yeah, no, he's the creme de la creme. He's funny, he's witty, he's just as educated and capable as Lucian is, and yeah, a real honestly, I find him a pleasure to read, and he's one of those rich authors where he's got a lot of allusions to things, and he expects you to know them. So like he refers to like obscure women who had sex with deities like Augi and Antiope and Melanippe, and I have to go look these up because I don't know these off the top of my head. So I have to search who are these women.
Yeah, you need the
um,
Oxford Classical Dictionary.
well, right. And I mean, I use Timothy Gant's Early Greek Myth, and I recommend him for a lot of things. But yeah, Celsus is just very learned, and he's just an ocean of information, and just dropping these allusions. Yeah, I mean, I would just encourage people to go check out my course. I'm going to give you Celsus's life and setting. Celsus on the variety of Christianities. He's a unique source for Marcionite thought, for Carpocratians, whom he calls Harpocratians. I'm going to tell you much more about speech and character and these specifically Jewish criticisms of Jesus. Um, I'm going to talk about Celsus and the Ophite diagram. Ophites being, the snake Christians, and how Celsus relates this to Mithraism. And of course, I'm going to talk more about Celsus and philosophy, which is related to Celsus and on animal intelligence. And then, last but not least, Celsus, his main thesis that what is the true logos, and how does that relate to what goes under the name of the barbarian philosophy. True logos is this ancient wisdom that all nations on earth knew, that has been slowly degraded through time. And so Platonism, it's not the truth, but it's a manifestation of this ancient teaching, which ancient sages knew. And yeah, including Egyptians and Persians and others. Interestingly, Celsus never mentions the Romans. He just pays almost no attention to them. But yeah, Pythagoras had it, Plato had it, Empedocles had it, Heraclitus had it, um, and yeah, this is part of an ancient theory that that the original humans knew the truth, and that over time, truth has been degraded. This is a very popular idea in antiquity. Whereas in the modern world, we kind of think that back then it was just the cavemen, and now we have science, and so it's basically flipped on its head. So for Celsus, it was the first generation of humans were the philosophers and or the true sages, as it were. And the philosophers of his period are just trying to renew that ancient tradition that has been degraded. And unfortunately, when the truth degrades, it degrades into something that's full of half truths and superstition. And Christianity is just one form of that half truth. It ultimately arises from Egypt. Judaism comes from Egypt. Judaism is Egyptian for Celsus. Moses is an Egyptian priest. He breaks off, starts saying that there's one God, brings the people to the desert. Then Christianity is a further degradation of Judaism. And it gets even more eccentric, where it's a religion focused not on God, but on daimones and on exercising daimones. And it's addicted to the flesh and addicted to lower forces. And it's just bad news for the empire. And, when people look at Celsus, they kind of think like, wow, he'd be rolling in his grave now. And that might be true. But, during Celsus's time, I think that his critique was quite effective, at least among intellectuals. Keep in mind that it really takes another couple hundred years for Christianity really to become mainstream. And so, yeah, during the second century and late second century, it was not inevitable that Christians would dominate the intellectual scene. In fact, they had very, very few toeholds in any sort of intellectual environment. So I think Origen changes this in the mid third century, where he's got an official school model of Christianity. But yeah, the success of Christianity was never inevitable. And although now, even secular people and atheists, they have these Christian presuppositions, so that affects their worldview even today. I think it's Celsus is very useful to think with because he does really attack the foundations of Christianity and shows you that it wasn't inevitable. Um, they don't necessarily have a claim to the true metaphysics, and a lot of what Christians are saying is against Platonism, and a lot of the Christian truths that later kind of got proclaimed and codified in creeds as theology is Christianity's attempt to take from Platonism all that they could, but in the end, they couldn't quite square that circle, and so nobody was happy in the end. Neither Celsus nor these people who are now saying, Christianity should have never had a truck with Platonism at all. So anyway, lots of things to talk about, and good things to think with. And this is a great channel to do that and to be introduced to some of this material. So I hope that you'll all support Jason. I hope that you will all support me as I try to transition in my own career and make knowledge public, do things online, make things cheaply available. So I've got to have people who take my courses. And, Celsus is something that a lot of people have shown a lot of interest in. I don't have a video that has any more than 10K views, but my best video overall is my video on Celsus. And so it's a service to me to now step back and to give people the opportunity to do a deeper dive into Celsus rather than all the superficial stuff that you can get on a YouTube surf. I'm actually going to take you deeper. So I hope you'll join me.